welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, a library aide here at the library, and I'm here with a very special guest today. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Hi, I'm Maya Rodale, a USA Today bestselling author of historical fiction and romance, and I'm here today to talk about my new book, The Mad Girls of New York. And it's based on the true story of Nellie Bly, who in the 1880s ran off to New York City to be a reporter. And the only assignment she could get was to feign insanity, get herself committed to an insane asylum, and to write about it. And she famously said, I could, and I would, and I did. And her story was a sensation. She launched stunt girl journalism. She was a pioneer for women in the newsroom. And she was also a young 20-something single woman in Manhattan. So she's fun. She has a lot of fun.
She's an incredible amount of fun, and the book is an incredible amount of fun. So before we get into the book specifically, I kind of want to ask you a broader question. You've had a really prolific writing career thus far in a number of genres, and I'm wondering if you could start by telling us a little bit about your previous writing career, what topics and themes have been important to you, and how all these previous experiences led you to this project.
That's quite a question. I love it. So yes, I have written perhaps about 24 books.
Wow.
Just shy of that, predominantly historical romance. And so I have spent a large part of my career with swooning heroines and dukes and very Bridgerton-esque historical romance novels set in the Regency period. So I have my own family series. I have a Wallflower series. I have a lot of, I've spent a lot of time in the Regency in my head and on the page. And I've also written a series of Gilded Age historical romance that drew really heavily on real women's history. So through writing these Gilded Age romance novels set in New York City, I learned a lot that applied towards my Nellie Bly novel as well. And you could say that the two themes of my work are probably historical women. I love exploring the lives of historical women, especially the ones who lived unconventional lives. And I'm also deeply interested in stories of women's friendship, in addition to a romance. I love a romance to drive a story along, but it's women's friendship and the real lives of historical women that really are a through line in my work.
Yeah, very cool. And I noticed that this novel, the new one, combines a lot of your writing interests. You have, historical fiction, you have feminist fiction, and a little dash of romance. And there is also a lot about like female friendships in there too, and female networks and support networks and stuff like that. So do you see this sort of as like touching upon all of your interests?
This book really does draw in all of my interests, and a lot of the female characters in the novel are based on real women. So the character of Harriet is inspired by Harriet Hubbard Ayer, who was like a divorced socialite, scandalous, moved to New York City, and also ended up writing for the New York World newspaper, as Nellie does. But that was after she launched the first like $1 million cosmetics company. So a lot of Nellie's fellow reporters in here are based on real people, other stunt girls or other Black women writing for the African American press at the time. So I've incorporated all of that. There's so much to read and learn about it. And then, she's got romances with another rival reporter based on some real life reporters. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, absolutely. There is just like so much really fun stuff going on in this book, even as it deals with some like, dark uh issues like with Blackwells and all that. You do a really good job of balancing like a sort of light and breezy tone while also, treating the subject matter with like gravity and seriousness.
Thank you. I really it was I really worked on that because yes, the story is very dark. All the other portrayals of Nellie Bly going into the madhouse are very dark and it's horrifying. And for people who haven't read the book yet, Nellie Bly goes undercover in an insane asylum in the 1800s, and it was not nice. It was horrible. The treatment there was inhumane, it was cruel, and there was real outrage once she reported on it. And she had to go undercover to get this story because they wouldn't let reporters in, which gives you a hint of how bad it is. And women at the time could be committed for anything, like they bothered their husbands, or things we don't understand today, like postpartum depression or grief, or so a lot of perfectly sane women or just women having a hard time were committed to these inhumane places. And so that's what Nellie writes about. And it's very dark and it's very heartbreaking. But at the same time, if you read Nellie's original work, she's funny.
Mm-hmm.
These male doctors are like committing her to basically like life in jail. And she talks about how cute they are. She's going through these like horrible cold water baths that like seem to verge on like torture. But she's worried about her hair and her bangs. And that's Nellie's own original writing. And so I wanted to make sure that was represented in there. And also like, I write light and breezy. I love finding like the joy and the fun and the friendship. And it's a sense of rebellion, I think, for Nellie to go in there and find friends she can banter with in the asylum, and friends who haven't let their sense of humor, sense of joy, or whatever be taken away from them yet.
Absolutely. Something that I love that you do in this book, and that I see that you've done across your other books too, is that you have these sort of like little injections of the modern into the historical, because you have like some of your titles are absolutely fabulous, like Lady Claire's All That, and It's Hard Out Here for a Duke. Amazing titles.
Thank you.
But what really got me thinking, and there are some times that you put like sort of modern sentiments in the mouths of the characters. Like there was one line that just stayed with me that was like, Nellie Bly could do this all damn day. And I'm like, that's a great line. But you know what? Like, I think it really works for her because Nellie herself was so ahead of her time. And like her writing, like the excerpts that you see in the chapter beginnings, it sounds like it could have been written like this century,
Right.
Fascinating.
I'm glad you brought that up. When you read her work, it's so easy because it's just a young woman writing like she's talking to her best friend, and it's so accessible. And that's what made her so popular at the time, I think, in part, and why it's so easy to read today. But I get in so much trouble. I've my whole career gotten in so much trouble for having like modern sounding historical romances or books. And at the same time, I'm like, where do you think it came from? I do use modern slang, and I'm not sorry. It makes it relevant to me. It's funny to me. I think I think it brings a relevance and lightness to the story. So it's done deliberately. But also when you're writing about really badass pioneering historical women, like they were pushing the boundaries. They were very modern, as you said. That's how we got here because of women like Nellie Bly.
Absolutely. And, I think a lot of times with historical writing or historical fiction, like we don't really acknowledge, I'm just trying to think of how to phrase this, every work that's about history is kind of always also about its own time period, because like the author cannot help but bring their own perspectives to how they view the past. And I think that you are making that like explicit, you know, and I think that's a super interesting way to approach the material.
Thank you. It whether someone does it deliberately or not, it's happening. So when we talk about like, let's talk about for a second representation of people of color in historical works. You know, you can say like, oh, it's not in the official history, it's not historically accurate, but it's the lens you do your research with. And if you look for it, it's there because people were there, they were doing stuff, they were successful and living their lives, full lives. I think now we're starting to see more representation in historical fiction across the board. And it's been there all along. We're just now collectively, you know, looking for those stories, putting them on the page and connecting them with readers. So it's just as historically accurate as anything.
Absolutely. Like it speaks to new research, you know, and it speaks to like actual truths about the historical past. Like just because we viewed it in this one very monochromatic way doesn't mean that that's the way it actually was, you know.
Exactly. And to your point, you know, when people look back at this time, they're going to be like, oh, they started caring about looking at this and representation, because we see this showing up in the work now. Which isn't to say people haven't always been writing these stories, but they're getting more attention, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, let's talk a little bit about Nellie if we can.
Sure.
She's such an interesting historical.
I love her.
Oh, she's great. And I love your take on her. You know, and one of my favorite quotes from like all literature is Neil Gaiman in Coraline. He says, "Be wise, be brave, and be tricky." And I think that that sums up Nellie to a T.
Yes.
Like she is so confident and so you know, sure about herself. And I'm wondering, like, how do you go about researching a historical protagonist like that while also putting your own imprint on her, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So researching Nellie was great because she left so much writing, and she left so much writing that is her unique voice and point of view and style. So she put herself in every story. Like, I was in the madhouse, I felt this, they said this, and I thought this. It's very immediate, and she is on the page. So it's an amazing resource to research. So you don't have to make much up as a novelist. At the same time, there's only like one comprehensive biography about Nellie.
Oh, wow.
I know. And it's out of print. And I weirdly like had it, went to go buy it again because I was like, I got interested in Nellie. I went to go buy the one biography about her, and I was like, you already bought this. Who knew? So I dug it up, and I had already read it and underlined it, but I reread it because her life is so full. So you I spent a lot of time just reading her and trying to represent her, but also wanting to write the story I want to read, and that's about an unapologetically confident woman.
Yeah, totally. She is so fascinating and so engaging, like not only to us as readers, but to the society that she lived in. And I love the way that like other characters in the book sort of like express their fascination, or like maybe even like horror, or you know, just like their engagement like with this woman who was unlike anybody they had really encountered.
It's true. She invented this idea of like going undercover to do a story, which questionable journalistic ethics today, but pioneering in its time. Herself in a story in a way that no one else was really doing at the time, and she spawned a ton of imitators, which was great because more women were writing more women's stories for the front pages of these newspapers. So she is quite a character. There was no one like her, a lot of imitators, and then she was just a step ahead of everybody.
Absolutely. You know, when you think of the way in which she, you know, went into Blackwell's with the intent of exposing the terrible things that were happening there, she was taking interest in a group of people who had been like basically abandoned by society, who had like fallen through the cracks or were explicitly put there against their will because they were inconvenient or made a mistake or just did something to sort of like make them too much for their families or their friends or whatever. And I'm wondering about like when you were portraying Blackwells, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this question, I'm sorry. when you were portraying Blackwells, was it hard to balance real accounts of the atrocities happening there with the idea that these women still have agency or still are, in control of themselves and are trying to make their way through this system?
Yeah. It's a system that wants to make the patients, women in this case, manageable. And because Blackwell's Island at the time really was like a dumping ground. You had the women's insane asylum, you had the smallpox infirmary, you had a jail. It was like all the people in New York City didn't know what to do with went to Blackwell's Island. And in the women's insane asylum, they didn't at the time know how to treat people with mental illness or literally almost any illness. And so the focus was just on making them manageable and getting a lot of women through the day. And so there was not a lot of care. And there was really an emphasis on like making them the same. They all wore bad uniforms, they ate the same food, they just sat there, they were drugged against their will often. But at the same time, like the human spirit is really remarkable. And not all these women were insane, not all of them were drugged, and some of them were pissed. So one of my favorite characters I made up for this book is the character of Prayer Girl, who Nellie meets in the asylum. And she is based on one line in the story of real Nellie Bly mentions hearing a woman just praying to God to die all night long. And so Prayer Girl's coping mechanism is praying to God to die. And she's incredibly snarky, really uses dark humor to survive. But I wanted, to show how the human spirit can like transcend all of this or like fight it. And remind us all that like these are people.
Yeah,
they're people.
I love that example in particular. Like I loved Prayer Girl, and I think that like the way you use it is so clever because with that line, like when you just hear a line by its own about like her praying to die every day, that could have gone in such a melodramatic or even like maudlin, like sort of really centered on like victimhood approach, but instead you sort of make it like an act of resistance, which is super cool.
Thank you. It's more fun to read.
Yeah.
I try to never lose sight of the fact that I am writing fiction and entertainment, and you want it to be speak to you, speak to us, and get us go all the way with it. So snarky girls all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm really interested in the ways in which like Blackwell's, and we've kind of touched on this, is not a place for healing of basically any kind, but it is a place for social control, where people put marginalized or inconvenient women. And there was a line that really spoke to me that I think comes from like Nellie's musings later in the novel, when she's like, any woman is just like one bad day or one bad decision away from Blackwell's, and how that could be used to socially control women who weren't even in Blackwell's. Just the threat of the place would probably be enough to like really constrain women's behavior.
Totally. I don't know that it was that, I want to use the word pernicious, but I don't know if that fits here. I don't know that it was that obvious in historical times, that there was this, like the Santa Claus for misbehaving women. Like, if you don't do this, you'll go to Blackwell's. If you're not good, Santa won't bring you presents. But I think from my research and from a lot of what I've read, there is a threat over women's lives that if you didn't play by the rules, you were going to be cut out from society, and it was going to be terrible. So in a Regency romance, we see that as a woman who strays romantically or sexually and who doesn't get married and doesn't do everything right, she becomes a social outcast. She has no way of supporting herself. She has no one to talk to. You kind of just go off and suffer and die is the sense we get. So women, I think, were under an enormous pressure to behave in the historical time period known as olden times. And whether it was, losing your place in society, whether it was losing a place in marriage and a way of supporting yourself, it was very hard for women if they broke the rules. And Blackwell's or an insane asylum was like a really horrible version of it, because you lost your freedom. You lost and it was terrible there. So
absolutely, like you referred to it, I think, a couple times in the book as a kind of living death, which is
right.
So accurate. It's like a social death. You're removed from society and just placed in this place where you have literally nothing to do, and you're just sort of like deprived of your identity even.
Right. And Nellie points out that if you were sent to jail, you would at least get a trial. And none of these women got a trial. They just got an examination by doctors who either didn't care and they didn't know. Right? They still thought like hysteria was a thing because a woman's uterus was wandering around her body. Like, can you imagine losing your freedom because of someone truly believed that was a thing that could happen? Like,
yeah, it's horrifying.
That's insane. It's horrifying. Yeah. So yeah, you're one bad decision, you're one confident man's determination away from just being stuck there. And I didn't read a ton of accounts of women getting out. I'm sure some did, but also the records were kind of spotty.
Yeah, I'm sure that these places had really great motivations to not keep really good records and then to obscure them or even destroy them, once sort of like covers had been blown and once these systems started to get reformed. So
right.
One thing I thought was so interesting is that while she's in Blackwell's, Nellie has to deal with the actual like crazy making nature of the care that she receives there. Like it really drives home that this isn't a place to heal. Actually, like it is almost designed to exacerbate any condition that you might come in with. And I kept thinking of like her friend Harriet's warning of like try not to actually go insane, having to blend in with people who have been committed while also maintaining your like mental stability sounds like an incredibly hard thing to do.
I think so. Nellie thought so. There's a line in her original work that she points out, like, you try sitting on a bench, a very uncomfortable bench from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day with nothing to do, and see how well you are mentally at the end of it. And again, they didn't know what to do with these women. And funnily enough, I don't know if it's funny or not, but oddly enough, Blackwell's was designed originally to be this beautiful place of care and healing by really humane, wonderful methods, but they got so crowded and it wasn't funded and nobody knew how to manage it and it was overcrowded. And so they forced all these women in. And, I think some days they did get to clean, but mostly they sat on the benches and there's no mental stimulation and you're not really allowed to express yourself or consume any news or entertainment or anything that would keep you sane.
Yeah, it sounds like
terrible.
It was hard for your mind to stay active with absolutely no input or anything. And like what your book does a really good job of doing is, depicting the people who are in control of this system and like holding them to account for the things that they did, but also like trying to humanize them as well, the people who were like working in the hospital, and some were doing their best and some were making compromises and trying to make things better, and some were delighted in cruelty. Like there were just all these different ways that you could like relate to like what was going on at Blackwell's. And I'm wondering like what in particular drove your depiction of Miss Grady, the nurse, because she's like a particularly thorny, difficult character, but Nellie goes out of her way to actually try to speak to her like human side,
My Nellie does that.
Yeah.
Real Nellie doesn't necessarily do that. Brought Nurse Grady up, Miss Grady, because she is a villain in Nellie's version of this, and she is just plain mean. But I was writing this and researching this in the peak of the pandemic, and when nurses and caretakers were risking their lives to go to work and take care of other people, and you just can't easily villainize or demonize that kind of person, or who could get up and put their life on the line every day to take care of people. And so I wanted to understand Miss Grady a little bit better. So my Nellie tries to do that, and she tries to understand how the system may have driven her to be as mean as she is. So it was a tricky line, but in Nellie's version, she's just mean. And I think I read somewhere that she was actually the inspiration for Nurse Ratched and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Are there other places where you take like creative takes on what you read in Nellie's account, like with Miss Brady? Like, are there other characters who you flesh out a little bit more or try to add some dimension to?
So we mentioned Prayer Girl.
Yes.
I made her up from one sentence. Let's see, who else? The character of Tilly, she is a very sad girl who's just ill and has some sort of, I think she might have like epilepsy or something like that. She was, again, her story as it appears in the novel was true, of a young girl who got sick and had some sort of nervous debility afterward, and was just dumped at the asylum because her friends didn't know what to do with her. So I tried to give her a little more, or to follow her story through, but hers is real and not sad. Or I'm sorry, hers is real and sad.
Yeah.
But I made up a lot of Marion. She's a composite of journalists, other stunt girl journalists, and also I find I write that a character like her who's really forthright and determined in all of my books. So she's Nellie's frenemy. But yeah, a lot of the characters are either drawn from real life people.
That's very cool. I think Marion's a really interesting figure too, because she sort of by showing her like going about her daily life like as a female reporter in this time, you could sort of see like how someone like her might try to survive in that industry, like before Nellie comes along and sort of like creates this idea of like stunt journalism. Like Marion works for the ladies page, but she tries to use that in order to get into like deeper, more juicy stories, and she's a really good example, I think, of like how somebody would have to survive in that industry.
Yeah, they were all pioneers, all these women. And Marion does a lot of high society reporting as well, in part because I needed a character to do that. And Harriet makes this great point. She's like, real life Harriet kind of invented the ladies pages, or like the idea of the cosmetics and health and diet and beauty content for women in newspapers and magazines. She basically invented it. And I know we can tend to slag that off as a society today, but I love Harriet's point where she's like, I'll never be out of a job. No man will take my job writing about face cream. So writing the different journalists and their different approaches was really fun. Because yes, there was Nellie and the Stunt Girls, but there were also other women pushing their way into the newsroom at that time.
And what about Colton? Is he also like a composite figure, or?
Yeah, so the character of Colton is a rival reporter with Nellie, and they meet when she steals his job interview, and he is pissed and he follows her getting the story. And so Colton came about, there's a real journalist named Jacob Reese who did this amazing book, How the Other Half Lives, that documented tenement living in the Gilded Age. And so he was a very, methodical, investigative, do the research kind of journalist. And I wanted to put that in contrast with Nellie's, like, I'm gonna act insane and get a story. So I love that dynamic against each other. But the other aspect of Colton's plotline in this book is that in The Sun, which is a rival newspaper, they scooped Nellie a little bit. So I was like, wait a minute, this is fun. I have to use this. Someone was getting the story of Nellie doing this while she was still in the asylum. And Nellie also writes about, in the asylum, a journalist she knows comes to visit her in the asylum, because word had gotten out that like this mysterious girl was locked away. And this is what I love doing, is taking these threads and kind of weaving them together. So Colton is a composite of people and stories and fragments, and then he's all smushed together into a love interest for Nellie too.
That is so cool. And I love the way that like history can provide this sort of like banquet of little details that you can pick and choose and like make your own like original characters out of.
Exactly. And I like that image. And I think of it as like filling in the cracks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there are all these silences in the original sources that we have. And I imagine like filling them in is probably like a really fun, creative adventure.
It is.
All right. Well, like congratulations on this book. It's fantastic. And can I ask what is next for you, or?
You can. So thank you so much for having me and for asking such smart questions about the book. I really appreciate you taking the time to read it and get it. I am working on more Nellie. I will have a bonus scene between Nellie and Sam Colton available on my website.
Oh, excellent.
So that story is, well, I'm not going to say more about that story. There's more Nellie on my website at mayarodale.com if anyone wants to go there and sign up for my newsletter to read the bonus scene and find out what else is in the works. And I am always working on more stories about women in history.
It's great. I'm so excited to hear that. And, if you ever want to come back and talk about any new projects down the line, like we would love to have you back. So
thank you so much. I would love to.
Yeah.
Great talking with you.
Thank you. It's great talking with you too. This has been Jenn in conversation with Maya Rodale, author of Mad Girls of New York. And it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.